QSO Today, episode 290, Janis, Carson, AB2RA. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. We are planning an amateur radio group tour to Israel in May of 2021, that's next year. A beautiful time of the year to tour and to play radio. If you think you might have an interest in our tour, please click on the banner on this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Janis Carson, AB2RA, has been an active ham since childhood and has an interest in the restoration and repair of older tube-type amateur rigs. Janis is a frequent contributor to Electric Radio magazine and does an amazing job documenting her projects on her wireless-girl.com website. AB2RA is also a politically active advocate for our amateur radio community to the FCC in Washington. More on all of these subjects in this QSO Today. AB2RA, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Janis?
Yes, Eric. This is AB2RA.
Janis, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it was fourth grade, I think. I went over to a friend's house, and it turned out his dad was a ham. I just asked to look inside the room, and he kind of broke house rules. And I just stood in the doorway, and I was just impressed by the equipment and the world wall map. And there was a huge collection of QSL cards. Of course, I didn't know what they were then. Years later, my grandfather gave me a crystal set. Turned out it was broken as far as AM broadcast band reception, but it received shortwave well. Due to the self-resonance of the antenna. And I heard the BBC and HCJB, which was a religious broadcaster in South America. And in the morning, Radio Australia came in. Then at one point, I heard K2IWR talking to some of his friends. And that call is today used by the Cortland repeater. He was an unintentional elder. I never met him.
But you heard him on the air for the first time.
Yeah, using that broken crystal set. Of course, he was running AM.
What was the time period, Janis, in the 60s, 50s?
It was before 59. 59 is when I got my novice license, which came about as a direct result of that. I had a regen set kit, and one of the ubiquitous 6L6 rigs. I worked for the chemistry teacher and saved up for a Lafayette HE10, which is often mistaken for an S38, but it had an RF stage and two IFs, and was a lot better radio. The antennas were really problematic. I had a lousy vertical on a 3-foot pipe, and I almost gave up the hobby.
You described that to me as a Gotham vertical. What made that a Gotham vertical?
Well, it was a brand name, and they advertised in a lot of the journals, Work DX and all of this stuff, and it had no traps. There was just a loading coil at the bottom, and if you wanted to change bands, you had to go out, change the jump around the coil. And if you put them up in the air fairly high and put some radios on them, it probably did work fairly well. Of course, I couldn't work anything but 80 and 40. There was a lot of television interference back in the day because TVs had 21 megacycle IFs. So I quickly learned to avoid that, and a vertical on 80 and 40 are not very good for close-in work either.
Right, that's true. Let me ask you, what was the hometown?
Ithaca, New York. I spent most of my life here. I was born in western New York, but My father had a job in the defense industry, and we moved every year or two. I've moved around a bit, but I chose to come back here. Actually, I was a Silicon Valley refugee around 1970. I lost my job due to a company buyout, and it was a downturn in the employment, and I decided to come back to New York State. Just basically crowding, cost of rent, quality of life, and I've never regretted the decision. It's just been tough at times to find employment, but there's a couple of large universities here in Ithaca and lots of tech jobs.
Can we go back to the Silicon Valley for just a second? My memory of the Silicon Valley in 1970 was, and I was young, but I remember going through it, that it was like a lot of orange groves. There might have been Stanford University and Hewlett-Packard there, but it's nothing like it was now. Was that your memory as well?
Oh yes, it was beautiful. When we first set up housekeeping, I had a house on South Francis Street, which was right in the center of Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and just a block away I could walk into this huge apricot orchard, and they also had strawberry fields there, and the strawberries were wonderful. They were the size of a golf ball.
So people don't remember that the Silicon Valley, before it was the Silicon Valley, was the fruit basket of Northern California, pretty much.
Oh, no. Actually, as a kid, I was in fifth grade, I think. I worked over the summer cutting apricots and removing the pits. It gave me enough money to buy a little Kodak box camera. I was interested in photography.
As you're a 14-year-old novice licensee, were you able to find a radio club in Ithaca or even a radio club at your high school in order to continue on being an active ham?
Yeah, the Mike and Key Club in Ithaca. It's mostly older people, but there was a couple of us that went there, and they treated us pretty well. And there was a similar club at the high school, and for a couple of years I was president of the club.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Oh, definitely. There was a show on the local radio station, WHCU. It was called Accent on Youth, and National Cash Register, NCR, paid for a half-hour program. I was interested in that for a while, and of course Sputnik was launched, and I saw it pass over and actually was able to receive it on one occasion. And that kind of settled me on engineering and technology, and I won a scholarship, and I went to Cornell as a freshman. Then my father lost his job, and we moved to the West Coast quite precipitously. And I did some work at a TV repair shop, and then went to work for a music store repairing guitar amps and electronic organs for a part-time job while I was going to school out in California. And that was great. Back then it was only $100 per semester, and we definitely need more of that today if we want to have kids get into STEM. If they can start even the first couple of years in their education at that point, affordably learn they can succeed and build an academic groundwork to proceed. It would be great if we could do something for American kids instead of giving college scholarships to foreign kids.
In terms of STEM education, don't you think we should start a lot earlier, like in elementary schools, with a STEM education or introductions to technology, physics, and electronics in the early grades?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that was a highlight of President Trump's speech last night for me was that he advocated for vocational training in high schools.
Well, I think that was pretty common, though.
Yeah, back then it was, but these days it's not. And for the most part in New York State, that's been outsourced to an organization called BOCES, where they can share a teacher among school districts at a BOCES facility and bus their kids in to learn stuff like electric and building trades and whatnot that will allow people that aren't college bound. And actually there was an electronic class there at one point that some of the kids earned credits at Tompkins Cortland Community College and went on to get a 2-year degree. But those organizations are hard to fund. The taxpayers are hard pressed to come up with their own needs covered, and so sadly, some of those programs have gone out of existence in recent times. I hope it changes. Ham radio is a great way because kids want to do something. They want to build something. They want a hands-on experience, not some theoretical, esoteric, abstract stuff with a lot of math. And Antique Wireless Association, for instance, is sponsoring builds for young people to come into their facility up near Rochester and get some hands-on experience. It's a great museum of old gear. They're adding a wing for amateur radio, but they're reaching out to young people in a very tangible way.
I'm curious, let's go back to your workbench. You're a contributor to Electric Radio Magazine. I now have a subscription, and I'm anxious to get it, but I see that you contribute on an occasional basis to the magazine. What kind of boat anchor equipment do you have, and why do you collect it?
Well, actually, I have always thought of the Viking II as one of the finest examples of good RF engineering. The audio section, not so much, but that can be fixed. There's probably going to be 6 months of tracking my process through the restoration and improvement of the Viking II. I also did an article on a DX20, which is a bare bones CW rig, and it's a good example of how many parts can you remove from a design and still have a transmitter that works. It's just fun to play with simpler, older equipment, and I'm not limited to that. If electric radio will tolerate it, I plan to do an article on the Innovonics 223, which is an audio processing system which prevents splatter. Very effective in increasing the audio punch.
It's my understanding from your list of equipment that you have that occupies your shack that you're not wed to a single operating mode. You actually seem to be able to operate all the different modes, all the way up to the latest digital modes with different kinds of gear. What kind of equipment do you have in your shack right now?
Of course, you can picture the Viking II, an HQ-180, a K7 DYY Class D full legal limit AM rig. I had to build a tuner from scratch just to handle the power on that because many commercial tuners just are not able to handle it. My original Lafayette HE10 from my novice station, I managed to buy that from an estate sale. The guy refused to sell it back to me. I have a DX20, an HQ129. For newer gear, I like the Ten-Tech Corsair 1. It's the original. The keying on CW is full break-in. Ham should demand a radio that doesn't have clunky standard relays in it. For FT8, I have an FT950, and for sideband, I have an Ameritron ALS 1300. I kind of wished I'd waited until they came out with a 1306, but the scope, the monitor scope, is an old Yaesu YO301, but I really like it. It's a very capable scope. And, of course, a Signal Link Tigertronics interface box for FT8. I missed all of the PSK 31 and some of those modes because I was just too busy surviving and being a single parent.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get outside and be active with ICOM's new IC705 HF to UHF portable transceiver and its optional multifunction backpack. This is ICOM's perfect solution for SOTA and parks on the air. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion with its base station features and functionality at the tips of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds. This beautiful new rig has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz, and includes a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with a live band scope and waterfall display. Unbelievable. The radio is 5 watts with its internal battery and 10 watts with an external 13.8-volt power supply. This full-featured radio operates on single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Included in this package is a micro USB connector, Bluetooth to support linking to your smartphone or Bluetooth headset, built-in Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone, which is standard equipment. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with plenty of room for antennas, cables, and other gear to get you on the air from the mountaintop or the local park. There is a link to this amazing new rig on the QSO Today podcast website for this episode, and when you order your new ICOM IC705 from your favorite ham radio dealer, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. What makes you decide what mode you're going to operate on any given day? Do you chase DX? Are you a contester?
I occasionally get involved in some of the lower-powered contests, where a little pistol has a chance. I don't have a beam antenna. I just have wire antennas. There are some vintage gear contests that the Antique Wireless Association sponsors. I was the moderator of the AM event, and I also won the Rollins event, which features pre-1960 gear on CW. They just recently changed that to also include phone, AM phone. But mostly it's just what moves me. I have a lot of friends on AM. I like to keep in touch with them, and I enjoy CW. And sometimes, the bands are open, and I have I want some FT8, and I've been doing some single sideband on 60 meters lately. I really hope that RM11785 does finally go through. Most of the rest of the world has adopted what we call a VFO band, and I think that will be a real shot in the arm for FT8 and CW on 60 meters. And the single sideband channelized part will still serve the emergency communications needs that amateur radio has.
For the hams that are listening that may not be familiar with the 60-meter band plan, could you explain a little bit about what you mean by channelized and on what you're talking about in terms of a VFO band?
Well, the channels are programmed directly into the radio, and you have to access it through the menu, and you have to stay very carefully on channel. A 15 kilohertz band without any particular channels would be similar to the more traditional operation that people are used to. You find an open frequency and you call CQ, or you respond to somebody, or with FT8, there's roughly 2.5 kilohertz window of range of people that are operating all at the same time within that spectrum, and it's you just click on whatever station you want to talk to, and you're off and running.
Is there a history in terms of the 60-meter band and how it was allocated? Are there co-channel users in 60 meters, and that's the reason that it was channelized rather than open like all the other bands?
Yeah, that's correct. Amateur radio is a secondary user, and government agencies need that. And if you hear somebody come on the channel and they tell you to get out of their way, you shut down, and quickly.
In your very extensive biography that you shared with me before this QSO that we're having, you said that you've become the Erin Brockovich of amateur radio. Can you describe Erin Brockovich and how you've become her in advocacy for amateur radio?
Well, Erin Brockovich had absolutely no legal training and became a paralegal basically through her own research and was a very vocal advocate for cleaning up chemical and environmental problems that had resulted from industries ignoring common sense rules. And so, drawing on that analogy, there have been a number of issues in FCC proceedings that, God, I had no desire to get involved with this, and I really wish it was over. I just want my life back. And it's been a 5 or 10 year fight for some of the people that I've been working, and it's taken a heavy toll on their personal lives and their families. We're facing attacks on the spectrum, and the ARRL has been pretty effective. For instance, the 3 gigahertz band, a lot of the microwave UHF and VHF bands, the mobile phone providers want that spectrum. Other services, France just recently had an initiative to take away 2 meters, which fortunately failed. The general public is mostly interested in mobile connectivity and 5G, not traditional radio. Most music distribution is done by streaming, not physical media like records or CDs. And kids don't grow up listening to a radio that they built from a kit or even something they bought in a store. They wouldn't probably want an HF transceiver when they can take the same money and buy themselves a nice mobile phone. So we're likely to face many more challenges on this end of the spectrum. One other thing is that changes are happening very rapidly for the fastest rate of change at any previous time in amateur radio history. And the changes are as fundamental as the transition from Spark. It's created band planning and legislative challenges, and we have to correct effective solutions that don't unduly hinder advances in technology.
Have you found, Janis, that the people that are responsible for this legislation, legislators, representatives, senators, they're really not up to date on the technology and the use of technology and how it's been used in the past?
Well, no, most of this isn't occurring in the Congress or Senate, although there is some of it. It's mostly happening at the FCC level. And some of it's just ad hoc stuff that's happening. For instance, FreeDV, digital voice, that's Bruce Perrins is at the core of this. He's an open source and Linux software advocate, but it's a way of transmitting speech, either in any spectrum. Simply goes into the input jack of the radio, digitizes it, and then it's decoded on the receive end, much like FT8. It is a 1.25 kilohertz, it's certainly less than 6 kilohertz, and it's appropriate for HF. On the other hand, one of the things that seems to be popping up is D-Star. It's a very wide mode, and people should be aware that FM has not been allowed on HF bands below 20 megahertz, 29 megahertz for decades, and the transceiver doesn't lock it out. So people are just doing it. It's turning into the Wild West for a while, and I'm sure in the phone bands it will be similar to the transition between AM and single sideband. And if digital voice proves itself as an effective weak signal communications mode, people will adopt it. There's no need for any particular regulation on that either, other than following the existing rules. On the other hand, we've had recent petitions from the ARRL which have resulted in RM 11708, which is now Notice of Proposed Rulemaking 16-239, RM 11759, which seeks to reallocate extra class 75 meter allocations to data, and RM 11828, which is essentially a free upgrade for text for voice and digital modes. The biggest concern I have is that this is purposed to fundamentally transform amateur radio into a free HF global radio email system, which for a large part is used by non-licensed third parties who can send messages, say, to offshore yacht owners, and they can communicate back and forth using that.
Right, those yacht owners, though, are amateur radio licensees, right? Using, say, WinLink or something like that?
Well, yes, they use this global radio email system, although there have been notorious incidences of pirated call signs staying in the system for weeks. It's hard to vet people, and the account is issued upon request. The other big problem is that there's commercial traffic, stuff like banking transactions. Our group filed with the FCC a huge 150-page Enforcement Bureau complaint listing scores of these things, people buying and selling stuff, credit cards. We had to redact the credit cards in the ones that we filed in the open FCC proceedings, reasonably furnished through other services, and that's actually a quote from 97.113. Sale mail costs $25 a month. OCENS, OCENS, is a cell service that gives you higher speed, and they just launched new Starlink internet satellites, which will give even better coverage to people in isolated areas of the Earth. So for emergency communications, this is great stuff, and it provides wonderful value to the public and to the government in cases of natural disaster like Puerto Rico. But a lot of this traffic is not appropriate for amateur radio, and I guess that's where I draw the line at it.
Are you saying that your group is actually monitoring these ship-to-shore communications, like through WinLink, and seeing that there are commercial transactions that are going back and forth in violation of the Part 97. And as a result of that, this is why you're filing against this rulemaking at the FCC where they want to kind of change or open this up to make this a little bit easier for people to do this?
Yes, and to his credit, Lord Cutchins, who is one of the WinLink leaders, has clamped down with a new set of terms of service, and they are warning people not to do this sort of activity, but it's being caught after the fact. Let's track a typical message from a shore-based unlicensed user. To them, it looks like an ordinary email address. That goes into the system to the designated email recipient, which is a so-and-so at WinLink, and it's transmitted without any screening by a control operator. If that was simply put into a buffer file that the originating station could review before it's transmitted, a lot of this stuff would be stopped before it ever went out over the air. There's third-party traffic to countries that we don't have third-party agreements with, which in the old days of phone patches would not have been allowed. And all we're asking for is everybody play by the same set of rules. You know, I give Lord Cutchins credit. I found him to be a reasonable person, and I think actually we could sit on the deck of his sailboat, have a beer, and talk about a lot of this stuff, and maybe come to some kind of sensible agreement that would solve the problem. The other big issue is the ARRL petition also asked for allowing 2.8 kilohertz wide signals, which are used, this ultimately would have been for Pactor 4, but Pactor 3 can be that kind of bandwidth as well. It would have allowed that bandwidth of signals anywhere in the bands occupied by CW, RIDI, and FT8. And our group felt that that would be appropriate if it was contained in the so-called ACDS bands, which are the automatically controlled bands specified in another part of the FCC rules. Currently, they're a very small sliver of each of the HF bands, and if more space is needed now that wideband modes are going to become more popular, it would be appropriate to expand those ACDS segments. And I hope the ARRL will change its approach to regulate the wider band and automatic signals that are used for this HF email to a readjusted ACDS segment and leave the lower roughly 100 kilohertz free for traditional amateur use. Obviously, if it's needed for emergency communications, and we've always stayed away from the frequencies of interest that have been listed in bulletins. Typically on the lower end of 40 meters, you'll find sideband operations in the lower 100 kilohertz used for hurricane relief. And so people are aware of this, and they can coexist with that simply by everybody sort of staying in their own traffic lane, so to speak.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. When you're working in this capacity, Do you do this advocacy in parallel or with the ARRL, for example? Do you find the ARRL to be helpful to you in your filings and your discussions, things like this?
Well, in the past, no. Very dismissive. This was their plan. There have been some changes. There are some good people that have been elected recently to the board of directors. Chris Imley, the lawyer who wrote a lot of these rulemaking petitions, has been replaced. We have yet another new ARRL CEO, and for the very first time, I am optimistic that we might be able to come to a sensible agreement that most amateurs will find acceptable. The emergency communications people will find useful and actually will improve their situation as far as having to endure interference from people who don't recognize their signals or can't decode them. You know, whatever appropriate third-party traffic from, for instance, Radio Relay International is another organization that is similar to the National Traffic Service. If they occupy the ACDS bands and go on about their activities there, and we can both share the spectrum in separate portions of it, it would be a much better approach than the Wild West, where there are no defined areas for those activities to take place. Even on AM, I find I tend to stick to what's referred to in the Considerate Operator's Guide as the AM window. Inexperienced operators sometimes stumble into that. Last week, I had a number of enjoyable cross-mode QSOs with sideband stations on 40 meters.
Should we think of the amateur radio service as a national park for nerds?
Yes. You know, people ask amateur radio, what is the justification to give you this valuable spectrum? People there is one single statement in 97.1 that says it's for emergency communications, and I fully support that, having been active as a kid in the national traffic system. I got a lot of enjoyment and training and built my code speed through that and improved my operating procedure. And it's good to have a pool of people that are proficient at such things. However, free email for unlicensed people and yachts is not mentioned there. That's not emergency communication. And there are 3 or 4 other clauses that deal with the technical aspects and the self-training, and this has a benefit. Now, unlike a national park, and I'm not slamming rock climbers here, but occasionally people get involved in climbing El Capitan and have to be rescued. Fortunately, amateurs don't need to be rescued from anyone other than themselves and their own foolishness once in a while, and it's no big cost. And the benefit in terms of hopefully young people pursuing a career in technology, you know, we had a group of 30 people come through our volunteer examiner session. They were all young Cornell engineers. My husband and I are volunteer examiners. And a lot of them were just interested in controlling a robotics experiment. Some people, I have a friend that doesn't own a radio for any other purpose than controlling his model aircraft. That's his interest. He isn't hurting anybody with it, and he shares the spectrum properly and observes the rules and follows Part 97. And it's a great opportunity to investigate servo mechanisms and learn technology that perhaps they might not have had otherwise.
Do you think we make a good case for advancing the state of the radio art by use of the electromagnetic spectrum that were allocated from the FCC?
It's very difficult for people to experiment in the microwave spectrum without professional level test equipment. But there have been advances learning about propagation modes and antennas, things which people can empirically do. FT8 is an experiment, and just recently, some of the software-defined radio designers, I think Flex Radio just got a huge contract from the government to design and build the next generation of military HF radio hardware. Now, if that isn't a solid contribution, I don't know what is.
Do you think that HF digital modes are a national security risk?
I have heard that, and I've avoided discussion of that matter in my filings. I think that's a matter of personal opinion. Certainly you could, Bitcoin has been sent over amateur radio. And prior to some of the discussions that have gone on QRZ.com forums and the FCC filings, particularly Huggins did some experimentation. Peter Helfert, the designer of the modems that are used for this, has provided some information which, he was justifiably reluctant, perhaps, due to fear of disclosing some proprietary secrets. Those efforts have produced at least a prototype system which appears to be possible to over-the-air decode this stuff, but will an average amateur be able to quickly identify a signal and decode it? At this point, probably not.
The amateur HF digital modes like FT8 or the others, if somebody wants to encrypt the data that's being sent on them, then decrypting them would obviously be difficult for amateurs and everybody else.
There are commonly available software packages such as PGP, pretty good privacy. There are techniques for embedding information in a photograph, a JPEG file that, anything could happen. And I just, like I say, I will leave that debate to others who feel it's important. You're talking about Dr. Rappaport, who has addressed that. I have never done a joint filing with him. Half a dozen of us have done joint filings at the FCC, which treated other aspects of this. I've preferred to focus on the Part 97 regulatory aspects and leave that to others.
Well, doesn't Part 97 already prohibit the use of codes and ciphers on amateur radio? So even though the digital modes, standard FT8, standard PSK 32 or 31, whatever the number is, the standard digital modes are readable by any amateur radio operator, and if they do use a code or cipher, then they're already in violation of Part 97?
Well, yes. That's because all of the modes you mentioned are what they call, quote, disclosed codes, publicly disclosed. In other words, either the equipment or the software, freeware in the case of a lot of the stuff you mentioned, that anybody could download and use their computer and a sound card to read. Prior to this, Pactor, the original Pactor, was pretty easy for anyone to get and implement. Pactor 2, 3, and 4 became increasingly difficult and more proprietary, and less was known about them. And in fact, some of the compression techniques that Huggins and Gibby finally became aware of during these discussions were the key that unlocked it, why nothing was displayed but gibberish. And prior to this, I would consider them, all of these Pactor modes, except the original Pactor, as being an undisclosed code because the average person didn't have. There were packages that were available for $25,000 or something like that, and you had to have permission from some three-letter spy agency to obtain it. That wasn't really publicly available.
Pactor is legal to operate in the amateur bands. Why do you suppose that is? It sounds to me like Pactor is proprietary.
Yeah, this whole thing has centered around the permission of Pactor 4, which is why the ARRL wanted to specify the 2.8 kilohertz bandwidth. You could buy sometimes an older modem which would do some of the modes, and you could buy an upgrade. But a lot of people don't possess that modem because it really has one purpose, and that's HF email. You know, the other modes, FT8, for instance, are something that a amateur operator, well, I'll spend $100 on a Tigertronics and download some freeware and participate in that. The other stuff is similar to the cost of a mid-range radio and is less likely to be in the ham shack, and it's one of the reasons why ARRL would have had to send these Pactor modems in to a disaster area because they just are not commonly available.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. It seems to me that from what you're describing and what little I know about Pactor, is Pactor has a single source of supply. It's proprietary. It seems to serve a single need, and that is to provide email over HF. It doesn't sound to me like it should be in the amateur radio bands at all. It's in violation of Part 97. Is that the view of the FCC, or do they look the other way in this particular case?
The FCC has not taken a stand on that yet, and we hope they will. The actual Pactor modem, it has come to light.
It's very expensive.
Yes.
And you can only get it from one place.
Yes, it's a single source. And the overlay of the compression mode complicates the decode because as you transmit the signal, the compressed signal breaks as the packets are broken into individual transmissions. If you lose step as a monitoring station with the transmissions that are occurring, the decode fails because of the way the compression system has been implemented. If you lose part of the key to the compression, all of the subsequent decodes are gibberish. Now, there is another way to monitor some of the transmissions, which has been provided by WinLink. It's called a WinLink viewer, and it's where we gathered that 150 pages or so of data during the course of a couple of days. That provided access to a lot of the internal traffic rather than over the air, but there's no guarantee in FCC rules that the WinLink viewer will be available. And in fact, there have been statements by the system operators to organizations like AMRON, which is a prepper group, that they anticipate withdrawing that after these proceedings are concluded. Well, that's not providing the ability to monitor. In amateur radio, it's very important for it to be a self-monitoring and self-enforcing radio service, because the FCC simply doesn't have the resources to do that. They have bigger jobs. For instance, there's been a recent act passed, I believe at Trump's bidding, FM radio and AM radio pirates are being put off the air. That's the FCC's job. Amateur radio, hopefully, is able to, discourage people who disregard the Part 97 rules.
It's self-policing. It mostly has been, right, through its amateur observers and...
Yes.
And organizations like that, volunteers who essentially self-police the amateur radio bands.
Yeah, the new Volunteer Monitor program actually is a joint initiative of the ARRL and the FCC to better police the bands. Whether or not it will be effective with this commercial HF email traffic, I don't know.
Can we change gears a little bit? It's my understanding, and I've seen your website, which is quite interesting, wireless-girl.com. What kind of resources do you provide there, Janis, on your website?
Well, I never intended it for it to be a lobbying or FCC regulatory resource. Once this stuff is over, I plan to pull the plug on that, honestly. Primarily, it's a resource for antenna projects, technical projects, old gear, just a wide variety of stuff. When I do a project, I try to document it and pass it along to people so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's exciting new opportunities that are coming about for people. DX Engineering, for instance, is offering an RF Kits linear amp, which has a Raspberry Pi controller, and it's a modern QSK linear amp with no relays in it. I would suspect they're going to give the new Elecraft KPA 1500 a run for their money. If I build one of those, I'll try to document the work so that somebody else won't have as much problems duplicating what I did. Things have changed a lot. Novice operators back in 1959, they built simple wire antennas. Why don't hams do that now? There's wonderful ARRL antenna handbooks, and yet people buy packaged antennas. It's a better thing to learn the stuff you studied. There are good stealth antenna projects. If people are living in a HOA-restricted environment, they can still do FT8 and have lower power and limited antennas. I try to, provide that as with the articles that I've written for Electric Radio on restoring older gear. Take some pictures so people aren't just guessing at how to do stuff.
Well, I urge the listeners to actually look at your website. It's an amazing compendium. You've got thousands of hours of documentation and pictures and diagrams of the projects that you've done. Do you think you have a theory or an idea why new ham radio operators today are not rolling their own antennas, for example? Is there something about our culture in the 2020 now that makes home building even off-putting?
It may be, and it may be the way that we recruit people. People are more likely to study online. They don't have the personal contact, the so-called Elmer, that I was lucky enough to have, and there's nearly a dozen of them that helped me back in the 1950s. Our club teaches licensing exams, and rather than doing a one-day crash course for technician, it's done very hands-on. And in the past, when I've taught those classes, we have tried to provide an Elmer who would help the person select an appropriate radio and not get the wrong equipment for the job, or a piece of broken used equipment, and help them get their first antenna up. And that just isn't happening for some reason. And I think people these days, when they go to buy something, they don't go into a brick and mortar store. They look for it online. Unfortunately, that's one of the reasons why amateur radio seems to be not as attractive to people, because they just didn't grow up around radio. When I was a kid, many of the radios still in circulation. My father had a huge floor model radio sitting in the living room that he bought shortly after he came out of the service after World War II, and it had shortwave bands on it. And you could hook a piece of wire to it and listen to the BBC. Cheap, disposable $5 radios are barely able to receive normal AM broadcasts above the din of these switch mode power supplies and the wall warts that are all over the house charging your cell phone. It's just a different world.
Right. In your speaking, I'm thinking about the hours I would spend in Sandy's Electronics in Canoga Park, California in the 60s, sitting on the floor looking at all the bins of parts and the smell of the electronics. And for a young kid, it was great fuel for the imagination. And I think that's kind of hard to do that these days. I see that most of my neighbors don't own tools. If they have a screwdriver or an assortment of screwdrivers, that's a rare thing. So it's a different time, I think.
Well, even in Ithaca, New York, as a kid, 2 blocks away from where I lived, there was a place called United Sales, which was a fairly large store, about the size of a small drugstore, which was just jammed full of World War II surplus stuff. And any time I needed a knob or a transformer or something, I could walk over there and buy it for cents on a dollar. And it was great. There was Radio Shack, which doesn't exist anymore. You could do small orders to Lafayette Radio, Ally, Olson Electronics. There were dozens of stores, and World Radio Labs built. Everybody was offering kitted transmitters, Night Kit, Heath Kit, ICO. And now you're hard-pressed to find such a thing. Although Bob Heil has tried to make such a thing accessible with his Pine Board project. And I'd highly recommend somebody that's interested in learning hollow-state technology, give that project a try.
I've actually followed that on Ham Nation, which is their podcast, and it looks to be very interesting. I think he's now in his 3rd year on this project. What's he building, an amplifier next or something? So he's always able to expand it, and I think it's a great way for people to get their feet wet. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, I think the digital revolution, FT8, narrowband digital modes, learning about new technology, new solid-state care, and some of the new digitally based equipment. Obviously, the average ham couldn't build an Innovonics 223 digital compressor modulation limiter for their AM station, but it's much cheaper than, say, the Orban Optimod, which is $5,000 to $8,000. It's what W1AW uses in their AM station. But for $500, the Innovonics is a good value, and it prevents splatter.
Do you have any Raspberry Pi or Arduino products on your workbench?
No, I don't. I was employed at one point in my career in the hardware end of it, and my husband, Don, is a software person, and I've encouraged him to play with that. And the RF kits uses a Raspberry Pi as a controller, and that may be the takeoff point for a joint project on the workbench with both of us participating on the next generation amplifier for AB2RA and AC2RS. But the opportunities are out there. All you have to do is grab a hold of it and learn it.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, get your hands greasy under the hood. Heathkit isn't around anymore. Back then you could repair your radio when it broke. Give AM a try. Most of the people in AM are willing Elmers, and if you show up, they will help you adjust your solid-state radio to sound properly. IC 7300s is one of the better AM-capable transceivers. Of course, the Bob Heil Pine Board project. If you want to build a big rig, Class E radio provides parts and directions. But by all means, don't be afraid to get a project and work on it, adding an N3ZI VFO kit to a vintage radio will improve your stability, and there have been articles on how to integrate that into a radio. Of course, all sorts of the computing power in a Raspberry Pi rivals that in what was a desktop computer just a decade ago. And frankly, it's one of the breakthroughs that has happened with decoding WinLink transmissions. That technology wasn't available when Pactor 2 and 3 first came out, and now it's available. And so possibly there's an open source and Raspberry Pi solution that awaits development for even better modes of digital communication.
Right, and it's a $35 computer at that, so it's not out of range of most hams, I think.
Yeah, it was cheaper for these people rather than designing a custom bedded controller for an RF kit amplifier to tell you just go buy a Raspberry Pi and install that in the box.
Right, you can go to places like DigiKey now, and you can buy DigiKey Arrow, you can buy Mauser, you can buy the Raspberry Pi as a commodity. You can buy hundreds if you want. So,
yeah, and unfortunately, this FCC activity has consumed the last 5 years of my available time, and I'm really looking forward to get back on the workbench. The Viking 2 project for electric radio was a big push, and I had to buy time. Fortunately, there's a lull in this, and I think the FCC is about to act, and I really hope they have more than enough information at this point to bring it to a successful conclusion.
Janis, you've been a wonderful guest. I really appreciate your coming on the QSO Today podcast and telling us what's happening out there in your world. So with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Well, I hope it's interesting and people will find something of value in it. If they will please be much more aware of what's going on at the FCC. because this will have an impact personally on them. And if you don't, step up and do something about it, things may go badly.
I think you're right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to point out to the listeners that there is a lot of resources on this week's show notes page. There usually is, but there is a very large document that Janis prepared, which is available as a download link. So please go to the show notes and check that out. Janis, thanks so much, and 73.
73 to you and everybody out there.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Janis. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AB2RA in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.